In the year 1815, one man stood alone on a hill in Belgium. Rain fell on his soldiers. His army was breaking apart. Just 10 years earlier, the same man had controlled almost all of Europe. Kings had bowed to him. Whole countries had trembled at his name. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the story of how a poor boy from a small island with no money and no famous family became one of the most powerful men who ever lived, and how he lost everything in one single afternoon. Stay with me because this story is wild from start to finish. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Corsica is a small island near Italy, but at that time it belonged to France. His family was not rich, they were minor nobles, which means they had a small title but very little money. There were eight children in the family. Napoleon was the second oldest son. When he was just 9 years old, his parents sent him to a military school in mainland France. This was a huge culture shock for him. The other boys came from rich, powerful French families. Napoleon spoke French with a strong Corsican accent. The other students mocked him for it. They also made fun of his height. He was shorter than most boys his age. But here is what made Napoleon different. He didn't fight back with his fists. He fought back with his mind. He studied harder than anyone else. He read constantly history, geography, math, and most of all military strategy. While other boys spent their free time playing or relaxing, Napoleon read books about famous generals from ancient Rome and Greece. By the time he finished school, he was one of the top students in his class, especially in mathematics and artillery, which means the use of cannons in battle. This skill would matter a lot very soon. In 1789, when Napoleon was just 20 years old, France exploded into revolution. For hundreds of years, France was ruled by kings who had almost total power. The king lived in extreme luxury, while millions of ordinary people were poor and hungry. Eventually, the people had enough. They rose up, they stormed prisons, they removed the king from power. Later, they executed him. This was the French Revolution, and it changed everything, not just for France, but for Napoleon personally. Before the revolution, a poor family like his had almost no chance of real power in the French army. The top positions were reserved for rich nobles with famous last names. But the revolution destroyed that old system. Suddenly, the army needed new leaders. Talent mattered more than family name. This was Napoleon's opening. In 1793, a French city called Toulon rebelled against the new government and invited foreign ships to help them. Napoleon was a young artillery officer at the time. He came up with a brilliant plan to use cannons to drive away the enemy's ships. The plan worked perfectly. France won, and Napoleon, just 24 years old, was promoted to general. A poor boy from Corsica was now a general in the French army, but he was only getting started. People who knew Napoleon at this time described him as intense and focused. He did not waste time on small talk or parties. He spent hours studying maps. He memorized the locations of rivers, mountains, and roads in countries he had ever even visited. Because he believed that knowing the land was just as important as having soldiers. This habit would later become one of his greatest weapons. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy. Many people doubted him. He was young. He looked unimpressive. Some of his own generals were older and more experienced than him, and they did not want to follow orders from someone so young. But Napoleon proved them wrong almost immediately. He moved his army incredibly fast, faster than any enemy expected. He attacked when his enemies thought it was impossible to attack. He won battle after battle against larger, better equipped armies using speed and clever tactics instead of just raw force. Within 1 year, Napoleon had defeated Austria, one of the strongest powers in Europe, and forced them to sign a peace treaty. He came back to France not just as a general but as a national hero. People in Paris cheered his name in the streets. Around this same time, Napoleon married a woman named Josephine, a widow from a wealthy family. Their relationship was passionate and complicated, full of love, jealousy, and long separations, while Napoleon was away at war. But for now, his focus was on something bigger than romance: power. The French government at the time was unstable and corrupt. People were tired of weak leadership. Napoleon could feel an opportunity forming. In 1799, Napoleon and his allies overthrew the French government in a quiet takeover known as a coup. He became the leader of France with the title of First Consul, but that was not enough for him. Napoleon believed that France needed a strong, single leader to bring back order and stability after 10 chaotic years of revolution. Many French citizens agreed with him. They were exhausted from years of violence and uncertainty. In 1804, Napoleon took the biggest step of his life. He declared himself Emperor of France, and here is the detail that shocked all of Europe. During his coronation ceremony, instead of letting the Pope place the crown on his head, which was the traditional, expected ritual, Napoleon took the crown into his own hands and crowned himself. This single moment said everything about who he was. He did not believe his power came from God or the church or old royal bloodlines. He believed his power came from his own ability, his own army, and his own will. A boy who once had no money, no title, and no name that mattered was now the emperor of one of the most powerful nations on earth. Outside observers across Europe were stunned. Royal families who had ruled for hundreds of years through inherited bloodlines were now forced to deal with a man who had simply taken power through skill, war, and sheer will. To them, Napoleon was dangerous precisely because he proved that an old royal name was not actually necessary to rule a nation. That idea alone terrified many of the kings and queens watching from neighboring countries. Once he became emperor, Napoleon did not slow down. If anything, he became even more ambitious. Over the next several years, Napoleon led France in a series of wars against nearly every major power in Europe: Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain. Time and time again, his armies won shocking victories, often against forces that were larger in number. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. Napoleon tricked his enemies into thinking his army was weaker and retreating. When the Austrian and Russian armies attacked, thinking they had the advantage, Napoleon's forces struck back with devastating precision. It is still studied in military schools today as one of the greatest tactical victories in history. By 1810, the French Empire, combined with the countries that were forced to ally with Napoleon, covered an enormous part of Europe. His brothers and other family members were placed as kings of conquered territories. Napoleon controlled trade, laws, and borders across the continent. But Napoleon did not only conquer, he also changed how many countries were run. He introduced a set of laws known as the Napoleonic Code, which gave ordinary citizens more legal rights and reduced the old privileges of nobles and church. Visions of this legal code are still used as the foundation of law in many countries today. At this point in his life, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. He had no idea that his biggest mistake was still ahead of him. In 1812, Napoleon made a decision that would destroy everything he had built. Russia had stopped following trench trade rules, and Napoleon decided to punish them with a full invasion. He gathered an enormous army, around 6 lakh soldiers from France and allied nations. It was one of the largest armies ever assembled at that point in history. At first, the invasion seemed to go as planned. The French army pushed deep into Russian territory, but the Russian generals refused to fight a direct, full battle. Instead, they retreated again and again, burning their own villages and crops as they went, leaving nothing behind for the French army to use. Napoleon's army marched deeper and deeper into Russia. Further from supplies, further from safety, they finally reached Moscow, only to find the city burning, deliberately set on fire by the Russians themselves, leaving Napoleon with no shelter and no food for his army as winter approached. With no other option, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. What happened next was one of the worst disasters in military history. The Russian winter hit with brutal, freezing temperatures. Soldiers had no proper winter clothing. Food ran out completely. Men froze to death in the snow by the thousands. Russian forces attacked the retreating army again and again along the way. Of the roughly 6 lakh soldiers who marched into Russia, it's estimated that only around 1 lakh made it back out alive. Napoleon's grand empire had just suffered a wound it would never fully recover from. News of the Russian disaster spread across Europe fast. Countries that had been forced into alliances with Napoleon saw their chance. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain united together and began fighting back against France with new strength. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon's empire began collapsing piece by piece. His armies, weakened from the Russian campaign, struggled to defend against this new combined force. City after city, country after country slipped out of French control. Finally, in 1814, enemy armies marched into Paris itself. Napoleon was forced to give up his throne completely. The power of Europe did not execute him, but they did punish him in another way. They exiled him to a small island called Elba near Italy. He was allowed to keep a small title and a handful of soldiers, but his empire, the one he had built from nothing, was gone. For most men, that would be the end of the story, but Napoleon was not most men. In February 1815, less than a year after his exile began, Napoleon did something almost unbelievable. He escaped from the island of Elba with a small group of loyal soldiers and sailed back to France. When he landed, the new French government sent troops to capture him. But something incredible happened. As Napoleon walked toward those troops, unarmed, alone, completely exposed, many of the soldiers refused to attack him. Instead, they threw down their weapons and joined him. City after city welcomed him back as he marched toward Paris. Within just 3 weeks, with almost no fighting at all, Napoleon had returned to power and reclaimed the French throne. This period became known as the 100 Days, and it remains one of the most dramatic political comebacks in human history. But the other powers of Europe were not going to let him keep it. They began preparing their armies once again, determined to finish what they had started. This time, there would be no second chance. Napoleon knew this too. He understood that the other European powers would not wait around. They would move quickly to crush him before he could fully rebuild his strength. So, instead of waiting to be attacked, he made a bold decision. He chose to strike first, marching his army into Belgium to try to defeat the British and Prussian forces separately. before they could combine into one massive, unstoppable army. It was a smart plan, but it would all come down to a single brutal day. On June 18, 1815, near a small town in Belgium called Waterloo, Napoleon faced a combined army of British, Dutch, and Prussian forces. The battle was brutal and chaotic from the very first hour. Heavy rain the night before had turned the battlefield into thick mud, slowing down Napoleon's cavalry and artillery, two of his greatest advantages in past battles. For most of the day, the fighting could have gone either way. Napoleon's forces launched wave after wave of attacks, and at several points, it looked like France might actually win. But late in the afternoon, Prussian reinforcements arrived on the battlefield, exactly when Napoleon's forces were already exhausted. This extra force tipped the battlefield decisively against him. By evening, Napoleon's army was broken and in full retreat. The Battle of Waterloo was over, and so finally was Napoleon's reign as a military leader. This time, Europe made sure there would be no comeback. Napoleon was exiled again, but not to a small nearby island this time. He was sent to a remote island called St. Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from France. He would die there in 1821, at the age of 51, far from the country he once ruled completely. So, what do we really learn from Napoleon's story? He proved that a person's background does not have to decide their future. A poor boy with an accent people mocked became an emperor who reshaped an entire continent. But his story is also a warning. Ambition without limits can build an empire, and it can also destroy it. The same boldness that took Napoleon from nobody to emperor eventually pushed him to invade Russia, to underestimate his enemies, and to lose everything. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most studied figures in all of history, not just for what he won, but for how completely he eventually lost it. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe, because every single day, past portraits bring you another true story from history, kings, mysteries, wars, and the people who shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which historical figure should we cover next, and if you want, tell me, do you think Napoleon was a hero or a tyrant? I will see you in the next story.